Some of my pieces can be narrated, and this one's called Existential Suffering and Primordial Anger. So this one, we're going to start now. There is a deep and dormant confusion that lies within all human beings. Confusion about the existence we are directly aware of, but cannot understand or accept. The proof of this can be seen in the world's most potent ideas about the nature of suffering and how they teach us to either tolerate it or circumvent it. The Eastern religions tend to negate human life by dissolving the ego, and the Western ones tend to affirm such life by reinforcing it. Resuming both, to not suffer or to feel pleasure. Can we affirm our lives with an ideal balance between both suffering and pleasure? Such a question seems to have the only answer that all we can do is try. Trying to balance yourself as an individual in this reality becomes very absurd after failing to do so for many years since birth, as you inescapably come to face the big question after becoming self-aware enough to ask, why try? Behold the absurdity. I try to live without knowing why. Excuse me. That is where religions provide purpose as the antidote. It's an antidote that we come to need as a result of the rituals they teach us to balance our suffering. Rituals are necessarily repetitive, and repetition eventually forces us to think about its purpose. The day comes too soon to realize that the stories religions give us about purpose are just abstractions created by equally weak ancestors, which serve to blunt the awareness of the absurd. This is what precisely causes anger. The existential confusion masked over by human abstraction creates an anger so primordial that we do not even notice its existence within us. There is no pinpointing a moment in the past when we became angry this way, but we become people driven in part by this anger. So, what if we strip ourselves of this anger and then also the confusion by stripping ourselves of thought altogether? Meditation seems to point us in that direction, and it is what leads us to the ascetic monks of various denominations who sit in caves or mountains wasting away in the bliss of their maximally negated lives, only affirming enough life by eating to sustain themselves in order to remain on that point between life and death. Most of them would not comment on either life or death being relevant, of course. Yet that does nothing to bring an individual any comfort or reason to become meditative. It would require enough pain and desperation to push them into that life to begin with. The luring idea that suffering is an illusion is not a natural path forward into living a human life, one which has a bodily nature while also endowed with a mind seemingly separating itself from nature through self-awareness. This is why I see Buddhism as a potentially self-destructive process, as they tend to conflate loss of self-awareness with the awareness of the universal self. The fact remains, however, that they negate fulfilling their purpose in this life. This is justified by the idea that our purpose is to release ourselves from samsara, a cycle of rebirth until we are enlightened enough to realize the truth. Purpose, whether it is to feel pleasure, even the pleasure of not suffering, either now or in an afterlife, or even for the lack of lives, becomes absurd without a fundamental truth. And all fundamental truths which have been constructed by mankind have always rested on a paradox which requires from us the skill to interpret such a truth to fit our equally paradoxical mode of functioning. Our needs versus wants. Perhaps this is why a priest, rabbi, imam, or monk is always attractive. People would rather not have to interpret the events and decisions of their lives themselves, as it brings them closer to the awareness that all truth is paradoxical. Those who have the desire to wield power, however, they are the ones who require that truth is interpretable, therefore a source of power, and so they become the priest, rabbi, imam, or monk themselves. They are artists who untangle their clients' needs and wants, and they match them with an interpretation of the truth which serves their own purposes. Meanwhile, none question why the fundamental truth needs interpretation. if it is the truth. It should also be remarked that religious figures do not have to be traditional. Yoga masters, psychics, fortune tellers, political activists, gurus, kooks, and social justice warriors are all forms of the disintegrating idea of the traditional power figures. They used to be seen as burdened wise men who exchanged their happiness for honor. Such an image was required by the followers in order to feel like they are less burdened, hence why religious figures are usually ascetic to some degree. But now people desire the power as much as they desire freedom from existential burden, and so they grasp at both. They live lives as two roles, the interpreter of truth and the receiver of it. I do not imply that they are wrong for doing so, as I believe it is necessary to do it. However, it is clear that people do not take on the hardships of both roles, but clutch at the empty benefits without having worked for them. Hence why society finds itself fragmenting at the seams when it comes to morality. Too many worldviews and interpretations coming from a place of individual selfishness rather than hard philosophical examination and honesty. Any and all such worldviews have their limitations, and those who defend a particular one are unable to see their own view's weakness, precisely because it is the current one they use to prop themselves up over the absurd lava rushing underneath. Needless to say, no one wants to get burnt. Perhaps this is why others are thrown into the liquid fire in their stead. There is not enough place for you is the mentality of the selfish. And let us make no mistake about it, a worldview comes from a very deep need for self-survival. The manner through which we harvest the power of self-survival, however, is what determines how evil or good we will actually become within the worlds of our own making. And some worlds look better than others from the outside. The heaviness to be felt by the responsibilities I have just outlined so far, in contrast to the existential absurdity I explained beforehand, along with how humans capitalize on all of this, is really starting to get dark and burdensome. Condensing it might alleviate the dizziness of it all. We'll do this in 3 parts. 1. Our existence is absurd, therefore terrifying and instantly undesirable. 2. We use the absurdity to make something of it, either through wielding its power by interpretations or experiencing pleasure from interpretations, or we attempt to do both. 3. The responsibility to deal with absurdity remains the same no matter what we do with it, and we are back to feeling the burden of it all over again in the Sisyphusian manner. Can anyone honestly stand in the face of such an existence and not feel anger? The confusing nature of this pattern comes from how quickly and easily the veil of purpose can fall from our eyes to reveal the harshness of absurdity. Balance within this existential hell does not really offer any comfort or solution either, as balance requires that we fall out of balance in order to continue striving for it. And this is an absurdity in and of itself. There is no escape from the absurd. There is, however, what Camus defended to be the comforts which exist and are equally valid to experience as the uncomfortable experiences stemming from absurdity. These would be what we regard as the simple things in life: art, food, sex, nature, etc. However, these things are not simple and are just absurdly paradoxical, as the pain of our existence really is. I can say this with confidence because of the absurd notion of balance which we are stuck with. All things in moderation, another trope repeated as a mantra without the acknowledgement of its underlying absurdity. Moderation in relation to what? By whose standard? Even by our individual standards, moderation can be chosen and interpreted at the peril of our limitations. Everything that I eat, drink, and do can be good or bad depending on which frame of time I apply to it. And even if I apply to it to the extent of my lifespan, I know not all the information necessary to make a judgment of good and bad. Therefore, I cannot truly achieve a balance which is not simply an illusion by contrast to other people's lives. I have dug to the bottom of these essential illusions to come face to face with Camus' singular, serious philosophical question: should we commit suicide? His answer was that even our self-inflicted deaths propagate an absurd pattern of not taking responsibility into our own hands in order to then face absurdity. But I have not yet found in his work any moral justification for being responsible to begin with. This is because absurdity, as the fundamental truth, is once again a completely flexible and interpretable notion, and therefore not really a fundamental to begin with. He just happened to interpret absurdity in order to justify the life he was living, but I believe he could just as easily interpreted it to answer this question the other way. Yes, we should commit suicide. Could this be the final honesty required to move forward in the search for a greater truth? If ending our lives is just as valid as living them, we are left with no direction to take, no decisions to be made. A true stalemate. I believe stalemates are necessary in order to find truths, as a definitive conclusion only offers us a prolonging of the truths to be found. Exposing just how absurd existence really is, especially to the point of stalemate like this, is cause for more anger. This is the primordial anger which festers at the deep, dark bottom of our very awareness, the collective unconscious, and maybe even the metaphysical. This anger is what has provoked in me more curiosity. I cannot say that I have found a new truth, but rather another question. What are we angry for? Is primordial anger justified or absurd? Primordial anger towards yourself and the world for the confusion of the absurdity of existence is to release something absurd, which is the anger itself, but fundamentally true. Conversely, that same absurdity can lead us to release an equally absurd experience of primordial elation, what is felt through art and beauty, what is in awe of existence, and also fundamentally true. Primordial anger and elation, which is caused by the absurdity of existence, both transmute into each other, justifying the absurd itself. This is fundamentally paradoxical, but true. It's a truth, a fundamental. My conclusion is that all concepts necessary for living a good human life require an antithesis in order to support a truth, which is conducive to living at all and living well. And so the antithesis of absurdity must be the concept of justification rather than responsibility. Why live an absurd life? The answer cannot be because you are responsible for it, as this would ask of you to be God, but rather because it is self-justifying. From this arises the responsibility to become God. My name is James, and boy, that was tough. Walking, I'm also asthmatic, so yeah, lots of sighs, but tough. Anyway, there's a Greek guy, a myth of Asclepius, and there's lots to be said about him. You can go down in the piece and read it at the very end. It's the postscript. I'm not going to narrate it here, but it uses the Greek myth to really give you a more concrete example of what I'm talking about, and it's pretty interesting. Anyway, thanks for listening, and until next time.